go into some of the storm operations, tools that we're working on, and then we're going to dive into our vulnerability assessment on US 74. And so looking forward to that today and the conversation. So Steve, if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. And I just covered that, so let's go to the next one. So how did we get to where we are? A lot of it really started, the foundation of this started back in 1999 when we had Floyd, and there's a lot of things that happened in the state. One of them was the actual creation of the flood mapping program in North Carolina, emergency management. So, and then they've been working on floodplain mapping and leading the nation in their flood studies and tools. And we're going to talk about some of those today, like Feynman. But 2016, pretty significant year. We lost about 700 structures during that event, and then we thought that was the hurricane of a career. Soon after that, Hurricane Florence hit 2018. We lost another 300 to 400 structures, so about 1,000 structures per both of those events within a 2-year period. But significant damage to the infrastructure. 2,500 road closures during Florence. I-40 and I-95 were underwater for a week. You couldn't get to Wilmington by land. You had to travel by boat for part of that. So pretty serious. In response to that, there's been a lot of additional work going on just across the nation due to climate change and adaptation. And we see, you just saw what we saw in Yellowstone last week, or yesterday, I should say. And significant damages and things, and those are, being experienced across the nation in different areas and things. And so there's a lot of federal work going on with resiliency and studies there. And then the state's also been pushing really hard. Executive Order 80 came out, which basically is our North Carolina climate change initiative. How do we adapt to climate change? And then how do we get to a zero emissions type state? And so there's a lot going on in those areas. And so let's jump forward. Next slide, Steve. We'll talk about Executive Order 80 a little bit more. And Executive Order 80 basically is how the cabinet agencies, so DEQ, DOT, DPS, Department of Agriculture, all the cabinet agencies, administration, and so forth and so on, address climate change. And they need to think about it in their resiliency, in their planning, policies, programs, and operations. So out of that has come quite a few things. One of those requirements is the next slide, please. The resiliency strategy report, and all cabinet agencies are to basically produce an annual resiliency strategy report. And so this is all coordinated through North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery, or Recovery and Resiliency. And these are basically published annually, and the cabinet agencies are working together to basically build a more resilient North Carolina. Next slide, please. So out of all that work with Executive Order 80, the requirements, the department, DOT, really had to establish a policy. We didn't have a policy on resiliency. So last fall, we finalized that with our chief operating officer. It was Bo Memory at the time. He's since moved on, but he basically had the vision of setting the policy in place and moving us to a more resilient department. The policy basically defines in just a couple pages, what resiliency is, how we're to integrate it within the department's framework, and then what are its goals and initiatives. And it mostly focuses on natural hazards, but we also have other hazards in there, all hazards. It covers all threats and hazards. So it's basically a mind shift to making sure that we're thinking about resiliency and how we address that. So you might ask, okay, well, how are you defining resiliency? That's a good question. Next slide, please. And there's a couple ones. There's one in the North Carolina Climate Risk and Resilience Plan, that executive summary that's available on the DEQ website. There's also a really good North Carolina Climate Assessment report. If you haven't seen that, it would be worth your while. But really, DOT's defining resiliency as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. So we're following that Federal Highway Administration definition as we talk about, as we plan for, as we respond to these events. Next slide. And then in addition to that, we've got the program that we've established through that policy. We've got the policies you see up front, and then we're dealing with the program, and then the practice, and then the outcomes of those practices. So that's basically helping us establish the goals of defining the core components of the framework, and then one of the important things is to just assess our vulnerability and risk based on the threats that we're dealing with. And then as we develop those threats, then we're going to come up with basically programs or improvements that we need to make to the transportation system to be more resilient. All right, next slide. And as we think about threats, there's a lot of threats that occur: natural hazards, technological hazards, human-caused incidents, that type of thing. So that red box there kind of identifies the natural threats that organizations across the country, DOTs, are looking at. Avalanche, we don't have too much problem with that, but drought, yeah, we've experienced drought in North Carolina. That's expected to increase. Earthquakes, we've had some earthquakes and things, but definitely flood, hurricanes, typhoons. Water, right? Water's a problem. We've got a big problem with water in North Carolina, so we're focusing on that. And also, water also brings landslides and other conditions that are, of concern in the mountains areas as well. So some of the other things we were thinking about pretty heavily are dam failures and how we address those on our network. All right, next slide. And so we've got some short-term strategies that we're really trying to do. One is just raise the awareness of resiliency, branding it, making sure that people understand. How do you incorporate that into your daily operations and thoughts and processes and things? So how do we integrate it into, our planning, our design, our operations, all those parts of the project delivery. Then we've got so those are kind of scoping. We're looking at scoping and how we develop guidance on that. Planning. One thing I want to mention too is this resilience program is crosses all business units in the department, right? It's multimodal, it's highways, it's ferries, and so it's aviation, ports, rail, all those, right, that we're trying to incorporate resilient strategies into. And so these are current short-term strategies, and then we have longer-term strategies that we're developing too. But next slide, please. So we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the investment that the state's made. We're seeing from the industry as well, the federal highways, and opportunities to, engage in resiliency. Next slide, please. One of the big things that our program kicked off with was back in 2019, Session Law 251, where the General Assembly supported basically some response for recovery funds for Hurricane Dorian, but the most important part was some of these dollars they invested provided for living shorelines, increasing our storm operation tools for like Feynman for transportation. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then also looking at vulnerability assessments on our strategic highway corridor systems, and that's what we're going to focus on primarily today. Next slide, please. In addition to that, there's current appropriations in the budget bill for 2021, and so I'm sure many of you on here the call have heard about the state flood resiliency blueprint. That's a $20 million project. A Division of Mitigation Services is directing that process. We've got the Transportation Infrastructure Resiliency Fund. Some of you may have applied for potential projects on that as well. We've got other DOT projects that are explicitly identified, but there's almost $276 million of disaster relief, recovery, mitigation, resiliency in the budget. So General Assembly is definitely paying attention and wanting its cabinet agencies to increase resiliency for the state. All right, next slide. But then on a federal level, there's also the U.S. DOT Federal Climate Adaptation Plan. And that kind of defines how DOT, this administration's looking at resiliency. So that's a really good document to take a look at. But just really, how would we, provide, ensure climate ready services and supplies, and then improve the climate education and research on resilience in the changing environment. And a part of that, next slide, please. The IIJA, but also more formally now known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the bill. And there's a lot of programs there when the state, MPOs, local tribes, territories, and such, that there's these programs that are available for grant funding or just program funding. And so this is just a slide that kind of summarizes that information. If you want more information, we can definitely get you in touch with some of our folks that are handling the grants and coordinating those grants in the department. All right, next slide. There's also some funding, and you all know more a little bit about this, the BRIC funding, the BRIC programs and things like that, and brownfield remediation. But there's a lot of federal agencies that are just investing in resiliency and looking how we can better respond to and recover from extreme events. And I think the other thing I wanted to share, next slide, please, is the if you're, as you look at grants, or we're trying to apply for grants, it's really good to understand the language. So National Highway Institute has these free courses on the web-based resilience training, and there's just a slide there, and you can go to the NHI, National Highway Institute, and go through those courses. But they're pretty good about giving you an overview of resiliency and how Federal Highways looks at it. And so it's a good background information of what they're looking for as we pursue grants, and how Federal Highways looks at metrics and what they deem as success. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. One of my favorite parts of this program, or the resilience program, is not, we're not just doing planning and things, but we're actually doing things that help people, right? And so it save lives, hopefully. So there's a couple of products we've developed since 2018. Florence, they're pilot projects, but they're really going to be tested this year if we have that event. Next slide, please. The first one's Bridgewatch. We're basically looking at, we're monitoring 15,000 structures. This is just a dashboard of some of the events that have occurred on some of the structures, but it's basically looking at thresholds for different threats. One's rainfall, one's just the depth of water at that stream crossing at that bridge. And then in the coast, we are looking at SLOSH, the National Hurricane Center's product for surge. And so if any of we set thresholds in each one of those areas, and then if one of those thresholds are exceeded, there's an alert. And if it's actually a gauge on the bridge and it alerts us that it's overtopping, that's a pretty serious alert. So we're going to take that into consideration. But maybe it's just rainfall over the watershed that was a 50-year event, then maybe it's just kind of an awareness thing. So we're working with our divisions to message that, to get them that information more effectively and clearly. And best of all, this information also helps us, start collecting information over many years, right? And so if you're building a bridge, you can go into the system and say, okay, well, how many extreme events has this structure seen, in the course of the operation of when we've been using Bridgewatch? So that should be helpful for future generations of engineers. Next slide, please. The other one is built on the shoulders of NCEM. It's the Feynman T system, floating road based on gauge readings. And so what this system does is basically works just like Feynman. And as the gauges see an increase in water, then we map what the road inundation is from that water rise. And so the slide was kind of moving through there. On the, Steve, if you go back one, I don't know if you can or not, but basically we have different levels of reading there, from 0 to half a foot to 2 feet, 2 feet to 5 feet, and then greater than 5 feet. So that's kind of trafficability, and it gives us the ability to look at what's happening on the roadway network near that gauge real time, or we can do scenario testing or forecast testing if that gauge is on a forecast system. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. And the other product we're working on with UNC and Department of Homeland Security Coastal Resilience Center of Excellence with Dr. Ludick and Dr. Blanton. So it's a combination project between UNC Renzi Supercomputing Center and the Homeland Security Coastal Resilience Center of Excellence is 48 hours ahead of time mapping those roadways that could be impacted by that track of the hurricane, and then getting that information to our decision makers in the DOT that need to place resources and things like that. So we can help save lives and just get information out to people that need it before these events. And then also on the backside, recovering quicker, just because we know when things are going to recede and that type of thing. So next slide. The official documentation of all this will be through Drive NC. That'll be the official. These other tools are kind of the background at DOT. So those tools I just showed you won't be for public use, but if you're a city or town emergency manager, you could get access to them. So and there'll be information through emergency management to provide that information to you. All right, next slide. Hit click one more time for me, Steve. Thanks. And then the other part of this is we're developing tools for just overall planning. So there's a geotech asset management database for slides. We're looking at how to better integrate that into decision-making processes and knowing where these slides occur. And they really are triggered by too much rain. And so knowing where they are located and knowing, using tools like BridgeWatch to monitor the rainfall or the watershed, we should be of early awareness of where these things might occur. And next slide. We've also mapped coastal road inundation, and we've gone up to 17 feet of inundation of our roadways. So you can do simulations and kind of say, okay, if we get a surge of 10 feet here, what does it look like as far as the impacts of the roadway network and that type of thing. So those are important planning tools as well as storm event awareness tools. And next slide. And then the other tool we've also used is the partnership with EM. We've used all their flood studies statewide, and we basically taken the 10, the 25, 50, 100, and 500 year multi-frequency flood studies, and then mapped those on the roadway network, and then showed the inundation depths on those roadways for those multi-frequency flood studies. So that's a great tool, as well as you're planning a transportation project or designing something. It's very important to look at those. You look at route redundancy, you look at maybe we need to upsize this structure, maybe we need to cross the floodplain. What is the criticality of that infrastructure, and what do we need to do in design to make sure that it's functional during the event of need. So, and then with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amit, and we're going to focus a little bit more on vulnerability assessments. So, and that's going to kind of guide some of the direction the department uses for prioritizing resilient routes and looking into where we need to make investments to protect the department the most for these extreme events. So Amit, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. So as a part of resiliency initiative that Matt just talked about, NCDOT has identified several strategic corridors that they're performing these vulnerability studies on, which basically, as the name indicates, identifies vulnerabilities along these corridors and comes up with strategies to make them more resilient as a whole. So these strategic corridors are identified based on how vulnerable they are to flooding, and also the communities along the corridor, traffic on the corridor, and other factors. So Atkins was tasked with performing these vulnerability studies on two major corridors. One of them is US 74, which runs from the portion that we are doing studies on, runs from Charlotte all the way to Wilmington. And second corridor that we're doing these studies on is future I-87 corridor, which is basically from Raleigh all the way to Virginia, North Carolina boundary. Next, please. So these studies, these are being performed to, they need to align with the goals of the department, which are basically outlined in NC Moves 2050 document, and also the Transportation Asset Management Plan. Basically aims to develop risk resiliency practices, build these roads and bridges to withstand future weather events, and then perform these analysis to identify vulnerable areas and so that maintenance can be performed on them, or an upgrade can be performed on these assets along the corridor so that they are more resilient for future uses. Next, please. So when we started out on these studies, the first thing we did as a team is to come up with a clear goals and objective to do these studies. As Matt mentioned, these resiliency can mean different things to different folks. It's pretty open to interpretation. So it was very important that we as a team come up with objectives that the NCDOT wants to achieve. So I won't read all of the objectives, but the top 5 were, reduce failure risk. Continuity was an important factor. Future investment and equity was an important factor as well. So again, we have very clear objectives for these studies that we identified. And so next, please. We also came up with study questions that these studies aim to answer. All of them, so they related to climate stressors along the corridor and how they impact future traffic flow. What kind of assets are more important for people and freight along the corridor? It'll also answer questions about environmental justice, how the impacts, how these climate events impacts these disadvantaged populations along the corridor. So we had really clear questions that these studies aim to answer. Next, please. So it was very important for the department to make sure that we identify all the stakeholders along the corridor, and during the course of these studies, we bring all these stakeholders to the table, and their inputs are heard, and these studies are conducted with their input and feedback. So as you can imagine, these are long corridors, around 200 miles each one way. So there are multiple NCDOT divisions along these corridors. There are multiple municipalities, multiple MPOs, RPOs along these corridors. And in addition to that, there are federal and state agencies which are providing data and models and inputs in these studies. So our state is fortunate to have leaders and proactive agencies that have invested in data collection models and other information that these studies aim to leverage. And so we are using all these data models and all the information in the study as Steve Bourne would demonstrate. So we use a tool called City Simulator, and I'll hand it over to Steve Bourne to talk about that.
Okay, thanks, Amit. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Bourne. I'm going to be going through City Simulator, which is the tool we've been using to do these corridor studies. I'm lead developer of the tool, so I'll just go through some of its history, what it actually does, and then talk about how it's being applied to US 74. About 10 years ago, we were, thinking about resilience, as everybody was, and we thought, we need to build a tool that can help us understand and quantify resilience and understand if solutions are to be put in place, how much more resilient will they make a community? So this was kind of our back of the envelope diagram we drew. We thought, one of the key light bulb moments was we thought, well, let's compare a resilient city to an unresilient city and understand what makes it resilient. And one of the things that we really kind of hit on was it's really you're not measuring resilience. If you're building a tool like this, you're measuring how well a city is doing. So the y-axis here is City Prosperity Index. That's a UN term, but it could be really sort of any metric of the health of a city, how well it's doing, its economy, its people, its natural, its interaction with natural systems, and so on. And really, when the thing that makes the resilient city resilient is that when a natural disaster occurs, it's going to any city will take a hit, whether resilient or not. But the hit may be lesser in the resilient city because the resilient city is just more robust. It's sort of considering what happens if there is a disaster, and it's making itself stronger. So you'll get less of a hit, but then the real difference is in the recovery stage. And if you look at our diagram here, the recovery for unresilient cities is 20 years, whereas the recovery for a resilient city is maybe 1 year after a major disaster. We thought, okay, let's build a tool that can actually create this diagram for us and measure the resilience over time and be able to project it into the future. To summarize it as a set of requirements, we said, let's build a tool that can capture interacting systems. We focus a lot at Atkins on flood models, but let's expand that idea and start thinking about economic systems, people systems, infrastructure, and natural systems. And let's build a tool that can model how they all interact with each other. Let's also consider business as usual as well as disasters. We focus on design storms a lot. Let's broaden that and look at a sort of a continuous simulation over the next several decades as climate change occurs. That brings you to the third requirement. Let's be representative of climate change effects. So if there are global climate models out there telling us how climate's going to change, that needs to become part of this tool so we can understand what the climate change impacts will be. Let's allow for addition of proposed strategies. So it's not good enough just to measure the system as it is, whether it's a city or a corridor or whatever it is we're modeling. We need to be able to add adaptation and mitigation actions to the process and simulate those into the future and be able to quantify how much more benefit they'll provide than the current status. Let's include a long enough timeline to measure return on investment. Each of these things we talk about as actions, they're usually millions of dollars, in elevating bridges, buyout programs for homes, things like that. So let's be able to measure it over several decades and see whether that investment was really worth it. And then finally, and this one may be the most important, let's be able to conduct this in a planning context. So get stakeholders together, very similar to a master planning process. So it has to be short, a 12-month time frame is what we were looking at. And it has to operate on planning level budgets. And so that means that you can't spend millions of dollars and many years in doing new modeling. We need to be able to capitalize on existing models to be able to shorten the runway and lower the budgets to make it a feasible process. So we created City Simulator. What is it? It's a map-based decision support tool. It's a plugin for Esri's ArcMap. And it helps communities understand their vulnerabilities to future disasters and find the most effective mitigation and adaptation actions. How does it work? We start by building a digital twin. So on the left here, we can see system users, system infrastructure, system control. We're building as close to a real model of the city or corridor as we can. System infrastructure means all the parcels, all the buildings, roads, rail, stormwater, all the utilities, and the natural systems. We want sort of simulation of all of that together. System users means people. It's called an agent-based model. If there's 1 million people in the corridor, like there are in US 74 corridor, we're simulating 1 million avatars moving around the corridor, using all the infrastructure and being disrupted when climate change, influences something like a hurricane. And then system control, we're actually simulating the area growing over time. as areas do, they urbanize. And so as that, we have to kind of control that growth as it is in reality through zoning, building codes, political boundaries, and so on. Those are all in place in the digital twin as well. Move to the middle of the chart, we do a simulation. Typically, it's from present day to mid-century. For US 74, we're doing 2020 to 2060. The nested loop diagram here, you see, that's the simulation part. So the outer loop is annual, runs once a year. The inner loop is daily, runs once a day. The outer loop, going around from the top there, we project for the next year what the improvement in the economy will be. And then we convert that into new commercial buildings, which we place all over the landscape using GIS suitability analysis, basically. We will then stock those buildings with businesses and workers. We'll then give the workers new residential, so we add more buildings to the landscape. We'll then add new infrastructure, so we kind of connect all the new buildings up together, so with roads, utilities, and so on. We'll then measure the how does all this impact floodplains, ecosystem services, and carbon footprint. In the center loop, the daily loop, we get a forecast of storms from global climate models. And then we, if a storm does occur, we evaluate which parts of the system are flooded, roads, buildings, and so on. And we put them, we figure out what's the severity of the flooding and how long is it going to take for them to recover and return to, use for the community. We also simulate commuting, people going to work, people shopping, people going to school, and so on. Throughout the simulation on the right there, we're evaluating key performance metrics, and they include metrics about the economy, stuff like storm damage, losses avoided, productivity, and so on. People, so that's like trips disrupted, who's getting disrupted, where, and how much. Low to middle income populations, disadvantaged populations, those sort of metrics. And then in terms of environment, we're measuring carbon footprint, both travel and for building operation, pollutant loadings, and several other metrics. Getting into the US 74 vulnerability study, this is a diagram of our digital twin. Some statistics down here. There are 1.1 million people, 4,200 structures, so it's bridges, culverts, and pipes. About a $2.1 billion replacement cost, 6,500 miles of road, 475,000 buildings. A big digital twin we've developed here. We developed it from existing data sets. As I mentioned, the process has to be fast and inexpensive. So what we're doing is we're using models, model results, climate change related, basic GIS, so rail, roads, and so on, infrastructure assets, bridges, culverts. There's a lot of data about those out there. Demographics, so from the US Census, we're getting population information. And we also have travel demand models, which we're using. Flood models, there's a whole array of those, which I'll get into, and then travel models as well, from the different MPOs and from NCDOT. Data from all these has been integrated together to make that digital twin. What does it actually look like when we do a simulation with City Simulator? This is a video that'll show, and it's got some annotation in it. Basically, you see the upper rain forecast, the red line there. When it forecasts a large storm, the green line drops. That's engaged workforce. So in other words, we're measuring every one of those 4,200 culverts, bridges, and pipes, and working out, which one's getting disrupted, and then the people traveling over that infrastructure. How long do they have to either take another route or not go to work at all? And so through that sort of calculation, we get productivity impacts. You can also see the other metrics in the annual chart here. They include things like the cost to run the system, asset management, the amount of disruption, the amount of disrupted freight, the number of long disruptions that occur, and so on. Some findings from the study: climate stressors. We need to drive our model with climate change influence forecasts. So we have a forecast of rainfall, temperature, and sea level. These models for this particular area show that there's significant increase in the 100-year storm, rainfall storm, and that's actually been happening in the historical record. If you analyze it statistically, that statistic has increased dramatically over the last 30 years. And the GCMs, the global climate models, predict it'll go even higher. The temperature, you can see it's just, you know, kind of a straight line up. There's a forecast, and coming from many different models here, they're all projecting a steady increase in temperatures over the next 30, 40 years. Similarly, for sea level, this is the NOAA intermediate projection of mean sea level increasing. Because we're doing simulation at kind of the hour by hour basis for sea level rise, we are getting, we have to add in the tidal signal as well. So we actually get a full hour by hour forecast of sea level over the next 40 years. Modeling innovations, regional rain projections. Typically we're doing a city and we just kind of use one rain signal as our projection. Here we're doing a 200-mile corridor, and the microclimates change from the coast to inland. In fact, there's 3 different EPA ecoregions we're covering. And so what we've done is come up with a system to sort of inflate or deflate the rainfall signals, depending on where you are, to give a more realistic picture of when a rainfall event occurs, how much rain is actually falling across the corridor. And if, you know, on the right, you can see Hurricane Matthew. That was the actual rain that fell over a 72-hour period. And you can see that it's sort of similar to the pattern that we're using based on EPA ecoregions. Flood modeling, we have brought in 4 different types of flood model to sort of inform this model. There's 331 HEC-RAS 1D riverine models. There is 17 HEC-RAS 2D rain on grid models. So that's pluvial type rainfall as opposed to riverine. We're also bringing in ASCE models for coastal surge. And there's also a full corridor wide Telemac 2D. That's another pluvial rain model that we're using as well. The reason we're using all of them is there's lots of different types of rainfall events and types of flooding occurring, and we want to capture all of it to make sure that we're really measuring what the risk is. Here's an example of a rainfall event. This was after Hurricane Florence on US 74. And what I've shown here really is that, you know, we have an aerial image that shows where the rainfall was. That's sort of the dark part on the highway here. And then the blue outline shows what our modeled projected flooding would be. So you can see there's pretty good match there. And so we're using that blue outlined floodplain in the simulation, and we're getting, you know, pretty good match with, you know, what we've observed as flooding in the real world. Other impacts to corridor users, you can see here, what we've done is, you know, measured how much trips are disrupted at each major bridge, culvert, and pipe across the system. And these are sort of the major disruptors. So you can see the biggest one here is on I-95, but they actually cover, you know, the full corridor here, with several that are actually on US 74. The metric we're looking at is average annual trips disrupted. So this is saying, you know, this is 600,000 trips per year. On average, over the next 40 years, 600,000 trips per year will be disrupted at this place at I-95 if nothing is done to improve, to elevate it or harden it or make it less prone to flood risk, which is a project that's actually going on right now. We're also simulating asset lifecycle cost modeling. So every one of our culverts, bridges, and pipes, we actually have a decay curve for. So we project the condition of the asset moving into the future. When it hits failing condition, we model a maintenance event. So replace that asset or refurbish it, which brings it back to good condition. And then the decay starts again. And we're doing it again for all the different assets. So in the end, what we can do is get a estimate year by year of how much it costs to maintain the system, and an estimate of the list of maintenance projects that need to happen. These projects are triggered by different types of events. A lot of the times it's maintenance, regular maintenance, which is predictable. So you can see that's 91% of the time here. But the yellow bars here, these are after storms and flooding, which is unpredictable. And, you know, the name of the game really is to sort of shrink that yellow triangle by being proactive and making sure those assets aren't going to be damaged during storms. Or if they are damaged, it's little damage and they recover very quickly. We're also looking at disadvantaged populations. And really what we're doing here is for every, essentially every building in the areas that are designated as disadvantaged population, we're looking at what is the accessibility to something like educational facilities, medical, gas stations, grocery stores, and so on. And we're looking at redundancy of routes. And we're also looking at, as climate changes, all these routes have bridges and culverts on them. Are they likely to flood, reducing the redundancy and making sustenance facilities inaccessible? Calculating that for, you know, essentially across the whole corridor, we were able to isolate locations, sort of the red dots here, where inaccessibility is highest for disadvantaged populations in the future. And so with the scenarios we're creating to adapt and mitigate, we're looking at reducing that inaccessibility. For adaptation and mitigation, we are running several scenarios, and they're focusing on possible actions that we can put in place. And those things include things like elevating bridges, elevating roads, enlarging culverts, additional conveyance, road relocations, flood warning, flood awareness, and so on. We've defined the scenarios like this. We have what we call a base run, where we do no adaptation or mitigation and find the vulnerabilities. We then do a current plan. So, you know, there's a whole set of master plans covering the corridor coming from different entities. So, you know, USDOT has a plan. NCDOT has a plan. The MPOs and RPOs have plans and so on. We've actually merged all those together into one comprehensive plan for the corridor, and we're simulating what if that plan goes into place. We're then saying, what if that plan considered resilience? So elevating the bridges, instead of just replacing them, elevate them. Instead of, you know, hardening or expanding roads, also consider resilience when doing the designs. And, you know, we're running that scenario, and it's showing, you know, really a big difference if resilience is considered. And then the final scenario we're running is basically the third one, current plan plus resilience, but also optimizing scheduling to make costs more uniform and predictable, and to reduce them as much as possible while maintaining the safety of the system. So these scenarios are currently being run and finalized. You know, that'll be the outcome of the study, is a recommendation of which actions are the best to take. All right, I think I'm going to pass it back to Matt now, and we'll take any questions and discussion.
Hey, thanks, Steve. You guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, great. So I just want to acknowledge the importance of this too. And I think a lot of these folks in this group, just look through the participants here, understand partnership and the importance of it, right? Between the different cabinet agencies, but as well as our engineering partners and federal partners and university system, as well as international partners like the Netherlands and things like that we've coordinated on these types of projects and things and gained vision and insight. So, but it really is a team effort to get this, you know, these products done, and just want to emphasize that and look forward to working with all of you in where you sit and the different communities as we improve resiliency in North Carolina and you know, protect the future generations from climate change. So with that, we can close or open it up to any questions that might be out there.